Eyes on target. Trigger squeeze.
Roger that.
Hold steady. Fire on my mark. Sensei!
The desert doesn't care what you used to be. Fort Irwin sits in the middle of the Mojave like something the rest of California forgot about. Flat, pale, endless. The kind of place where the heat arrives before sunrise and stays long after the sun goes down. Where the wind carries sand that gets into everything, your gear, your food, the corners of your eyes. Where the silence between gunshots feels heavier than the shots themselves. It was 0430 when Carol Voss walked out onto Range 7. No instructor, no evaluator, no one watching from the observation tower with a clipboard and a stopwatch. Just her, the rifle, and 18 silhouette targets arranged at intervals from 50 meters out to 200. She was 58 years old, medium height, built lean in the way that comes from decades of use rather than effort. Dark hair going gray at the temples, pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it looked like it had always been that way. Her fatigues were worn at the knees. Her boots were government-issue Resoled, twice the heels worn down at an angle that spoke of years of identical movement. She stood at the firing line for a moment without raising the weapon. Just looked at the targets. Then she raised the rifle, settled into her stance, and began. The first shot broke the desert silence like a crack of dry wood. The second followed before the echo had fully died. By the third, she had found her rhythm, that deep, unhurried cadence that has nothing to do with speed and everything to do with certainty. Each trigger pull was the same, each breath the same, each target acquired and engaged with the kind of economy that does not come from talent. It comes from 30 years of doing one thing until it stops being a skill and becomes a fact about you. Like the color of your eyes, like the way you walk. 6 shots, 6 targets, 6 rounds through the same ragged hole in the center of each silhouette. She lowered the rifle, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber with a motion so automatic her eyes were already scanning the horizon. Then the training facility's wake-up siren sounded in the distance. Carol Voss safed the weapon, picked up her brass, and walked back to the barracks like someone who had just taken a morning walk. The transport had brought Class Bravo 12 in the previous afternoon. 14 soldiers, various backgrounds, various ages, various reasons for being there. Advanced combat. Training, the kind of program that existed to take people who were already good and determine whether they could be better, or whether they had peaked. The admin sergeant at the intake desk had the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed 1,000 classes exactly like this one. He slid a key card across the counter without looking up. Room 214, second floor. Briefings start at 0600. Don't be late. These instructors don't care what your record says. Carol took the card, said nothing. Her room was at the end of the hall, corner position. She chose the bunk against the far wall, the one with a clear line of sight to both the door and the window. She did not think about why she chose it. She had not thought about it for 20 years. It was simply where she sat, where she slept, where she positioned herself in every room she had ever entered since a night in Mogadishu in 1994, when the wrong seat had gotten a man killed. Not her, someone else. But she had watched it happen, and some lessons do not leave you. They install themselves. She unpacked her gear with the methodical precision of someone for whom organization is not a preference, but a survival habit. Everything in its place. Everything accessible. Nothing wasted, nothing redundant. She sat on the bunk, looked at her hands for a moment. Then she called her daughter. 3 rings. Voicemail. She left a brief message, the kind that says, everything is fine, without saying much of anything. The kind you leave when the person you are calling knows better than to ask the questions that actually matter, because the answers are never quite what either of you needs them to be. She set the phone down, lay back on the bunk, stared at the ceiling. Sleep came in 20 minutes exactly. It always did. Corporal Eli Nash noticed the file on his second day. He was helping the admin clerk cross-reference personnel records, grunt work, the kind of task that got handed to the youngest person in the room when he pulled Carol Voss's folder and felt the difference in weight before he opened it. Too thin. Military personnel files had a standard heft to them. Years of evaluations, citations, training records, medical history, deployment logs. They told a story whether you wanted them to or not. This one opened to 3 pages of standard biographical information, date of birth, enlistment, date, initial training, record, and then nothing. Not redacted in the normal sense. Redacted meant black bars over specific lines. This was different. Pages that should have existed simply did not. 11 of them by Nash's count based on the page numbers that skipped from 3 to 15 without explanation. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked across the room at Carol Voss, who was sitting alone at the far table in the mess, eating her breakfast with the quiet efficiency of someone with somewhere more important to be, and filed the information away without knowing why. At 0600, Master Chief Dale Harmon stood at the front of the briefing room and looked at the 14 faces in front of him. He was 61 by young, broad across the shoulders in a way that had settled into something solid and permanent, a face that had done its share of weathering. He had run programs like this one for 9 years after 22 years of doing the thing the program was designed to train people for. He had the particular stillness of someone who had stopped needing to demonstrate anything a long time ago. He looked at the class the way a diagnostician looks at a patient before the tests come back, systematically, without conclusion. His eyes passed over Carol Voss and moved on, then came back, something about the way she sat. Not the posture, though. The posture was correct, squared regulation. It was the quality underneath it. The way her eyes had already mapped the room before she sat down. The way she held her hands loose available, not the stillness of someone at rest, but the stillness of someone at ready. The way she had chosen the second row from the back left side where she could see every face in both exits without appearing to try. Harmon had seen that quality exactly 3 times before in his career. Each time it had meant the same thing. Someone who had spent years in environments where the wrong thought at the wrong moment could get you and everyone near you killed. He kept his face neutral, moved on, delivered his briefing, but he made a note, the kind you make in the back of your mind in a folder that does not close. The rifle qualification range stretched out under a sky that had gone from dark to pale to the harsh white of a desert morning. Targets at 200 meters, standard silhouettes. The kind of shooting that anyone with advanced training should handle with room to spare. Captain Derek Shaw went first. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who had been the best in every room he had walked into since the age of 19 and had never yet encountered a room that corrected that impression. His uniform was perfect. His rifle was clean. He shot a qualifying score with the smooth efficiency of a man who knew exactly how good he was. He knew it, and he made sure the people watching knew that he knew it. Sergeant Marcus Webb went next, then Sergeant Dana Ritchie, then a half-dozen other scores clustering in a range that Harmon noted as solid if unspectacular. Then Carol Voss stepped to the line. She raised the rifle, took her time with the sight picture, fired. Wide right, not by much but enough. She reloaded, fired it again. The angle was off, the round caught the edge of the silhouette rather than the center. Her reload between shots was slower than it should have been. Her stance had a slight rigidity that experienced eyes would read as uncertainty. When time was called, her target looked like the work of someone still finding their fundamentals. The instructor marked her score without expression. Then he said, not quietly enough, "You are going to need to do a lot better than that, Voss." Behind her, Shaw's voice carried the particular tone of someone who has made a decision about a person and stopped considering new information. Some records do not transfer. Guess we will find out what else does not. Webb chuckled. Ritchie smiled the kind of smile that costs nothing to give and lands exactly where it is aimed. Carol walked off the line. Her face said nothing. But Harmon was watching her hands. They were steady. Not steady the way hands are steady when you are calm. Steady the way hands are steady when you are controlling something. The nickname started that afternoon. Nash heard it first in the equipment bay when Shaw was talking to Webb about the morning's qualification scores. Russ, Shaw said, nodding toward the rack where Carol's gear was stored. You know, like metal that used to work. Webb looked at the gear, then at Shaw. Then he smiled. It spread through the class the way nicknames spread, not all at once, but in the way that water finds cracks. By dinner, it was established. By the next morning, it was simply true, the way things become true when enough people repeat them without questioning them. Rust, the woman who used to be something and no longer was. Carol heard it. Of course she heard it. She had spent 30 years developing the ability to hear what people thought they were saying quietly. She filed it away the way she filed away everything, not with anger, not with hurt, but with the particular neutrality of someone who has learned that information is only useful if you do not let it change how you move. She ate her dinner, 3 items, arranged with the kind of unconscious precision that spoke of years spent where calories had tactical implications. Webb muttered something to Ritchie that made her laugh. Nash looked at Carol and then looked away. Carol set her tray in the return rack and walked out without looking at any of them. Not from indifference, from the particular economy of someone who had learned long ago that attention was a resource, and spending it on people who had already decided what they thought of you was a form of waste she could not afford. That night, she called her daughter again. This time she answered. "Hey, Mom, how's it going out there?" "Good. Fine, standard stuff. You eating always?" A pause, the kind that carries weight neither person wants to name. "Mom, you do not have to prove anything. You know that, right?" Carol looked at the ceiling. "I know, I mean it. You have already done more than I know, sweetheart." Another pause. "Longer. I love you," her daughter said. "I love you too. Get some sleep." She set the phone down, lay in the dark for a while, listened to the desert outside, that particular Mojave silence that is not really silence at all, but a low, constant presence like something enormous, breathing slowly in the dark. She thought about Rowan Kidd. She did not mean to. She rarely did deliberately. But the flashbang simulator they had used at the end of the obstacle run, that day, the sharp crack the white light had opened. Something the way a sound can open a door you had thought you had bolted shut. Staff Sergeant, First Class Rowan Kidd, 37 years old in 2009. Married. 2 sons. He had a laugh that arrived before his jokes did, and he had been the best partner Carol had worked with in 20 years of field operations. The kind of soldier who made everyone around him better just by being present. The IED had been buried 12 inches under a road that their intelligence said was clear. It was not clear. She had been 20 feet back. She had heard the sound. She had felt the pressure change. And in the 2 seconds between that sound and the moment when she processed what had happened, some deeply trained part of her had already made a calculation assess before moving. Contain your reaction. Wait for information. By the time she moved, it was over. She had analyzed those 2 seconds 1,000 times since. Whether a different choice would have changed anything, whether the hesitation was training or fear, or something that did not have a name, whether Rowan would have understood. She thought he would have, but she had never been certain, and that uncertainty had installed itself in the same place as all the other lessons that do not leave you. The urban combat course was built from shipping containers and plywood, a maze that smelled of sawdust and the lingering ghost of simulated gunpowder. It had been designed to replicate the geometry of real close quarters fighting, the narrow angles, the unexpected doors, the rooms that opened onto other rooms without warning. Carol had cleared rooms like this for real, in places that did not make it onto news reports, in conditions that bore no relationship to any training environment she had ever encountered. She knew this going in. She also knew that knowing it was not going to be enough. When her turn came to run the kill house, she stacked outside the first door the way she had been trained, weapon up, breathing controlled. The instructor gave her the signal. She moved, but not fast enough. Her entry was clean but measured, and the paper target inside had time. She engaged it, but a fraction of a second late enough that the instructor marked it as a hit on her simulated teammate. She pushed to the next room. Her muzzle angle was slightly off on the first sweep. She corrected, but the correction itself cost time, and by the end of the run, 3 additional casualties were marked against her. She knew where every one of them came from. She knew the exact calculation behind each one. But that knowledge sat in one part of her brain, while another part listened for a sound that was not there, tracked a shape that was not there, stayed half present in a place she had been trying to leave for 15 years. When the buzzer sounded, red light failure, she heard the instructor's voice as if from a distance. "Voss, you still with us?" She blinked, oriented herself, nodded once. In the staging area, Shaw's voice found her before she had finished clearing her weapon. That was genuinely painful to watch. I mean that sincerely. Webb crossed his arms. She is not just struggling, she is a liability. Richie, sharper than either of them, said nothing. Just watched Carol with the particular attention of someone collecting data. Nash watched too, but what he was watching was not Carol's performance. He was watching her hands, the way they moved through the post-run clearing drill with a precision that did not match anything else she had done on the course. The way her fingers indexed the safety, dropped the magazine, racked the slide, each motion clean and certain and absolutely automatic. Like someone who had done it so many times it had stopped being a decision. He stored that in the same folder where he had stored the missing pages. Master Chief Harmon watched from the observation platform above the staging area. He had been running this program for 9 years. He had seen people fail at it in every way it was possible to fail. He had seen people who lacked the physical capability, and people who lacked the mental toughness, and people who had both but could not integrate them under pressure. He had seen people who were genuinely past their prime, whose bodies or reflexes or nerve had eroded past the point of recovery. He knew what that looked like. This was not what that looked like. What he was watching was something he had seen only a handful of times in his career, and it had taken him years to develop the vocabulary for it. Not failure, not decline, something more precise and in its own way more troubling. Containment. A person who had learned for whatever reason, through whatever mechanism, to suppress the thing they actually were, to keep it behind glass, to present the world with a performance of limitation that the person underneath was meticulously engineering. The question was why. He had asked himself that question 4 times in his career about 4 different people. 3 of those people had been carrying something too heavy to put down, something that made operating at full capacity feel like a betrayal of themselves or someone they had lost. The 4th had been doing it for reasons Harmon had never fully understood until he recognized them as his own. That person had been Dale Harmon himself, after Mogadishu, after 1993, when he had come back and spent 8 months performing adequacy because performing excellence had started to feel obscene in the face of what he had seen there. He had been pulled out of that by a colonel who had served with him, who had walked up to him on a range one afternoon and said 4 words that had nothing to do with tactics or training or performance reviews. He still thought about those 4 words. He looked at Carol Voss's scorecard. Bottom third, officially struggling, officially approaching the threshold that would trigger administrative review. He picked up his pen, wrote his assessment, clinical, accurate, everything the record required. Then he paused, added a single line in his own handwriting at the bottom that was not part of the official form. She knows exactly what she is doing. The question is why she is choosing not to. He capped his pen, set the clipboard down, kept watching. At 2100 hours, when the barracks had settled into the specific nighttime quiet of people who are tired in the way that only physical training produces, Carol sat at the small desk in her room. She took out a sheet of paper. A single sheet, unlined, the kind she had carried in the inside pocket of her field jacket for 15 years without ever having a specific reason. She wrote for 11 minutes, not fast, not slow, the way you write when you are choosing words, the way you would choose your footing on uncertain ground. When she was done, she folded the paper twice, placed it in an envelope, took a pen and wrote a name on the outside, Colonel Grant Teller. She set it on the desk, looked at it for a moment. Then she placed it inside her copy of the training manual between pages 44 and 45 and turned off the light. Outside, the Mojave was doing what the Mojave does at night, breathing cold after the heat of the day, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in an hour, the stars coming out in numbers that people who live in cities spend their whole lives not knowing exist. Carol lay in the dark. She thought about Somalia, about a younger version of herself who had not yet learned to hold back, who had moved through rooms without hesitation, who had trusted the thing she was completely, who had never once questioned whether she deserved to operate at the level she was capable of. She thought about Rowan. She thought about what he would have said about all of this. She thought she knew. She was not ready to hear it yet, but she thought she knew. Sleep came, slower than usual, but it came. And somewhere across the base, in a small office in the administration building, Master Chief Dale Harmon sat at his desk with Carol Voss's file open in front of him. He had been sitting there for 40 minutes. He thought about a colonel who had walked up to him on a range in 1994 and said 4 words. He thought about what it had felt like to finally be seen by someone who understood the specific shape of what he was carrying. He thought that some things can only be recognized by the people who have carried them. He closed the file, and he picked up the phone. It rang 5 times. He was about to give up when it connected. The voice on the other end said one word. "Harmon," he said, "Colonel Teller, I have someone in my program you need to know about." A pause, then, "What is her name?" He had not said her. He had not mentioned a gender. He noted that without commenting on it. He said Voss, Carol Voss. The pause on the other end was 2 seconds, then 3. "Teller said I will call you back in the morning." The line went quiet. Harmon set the phone down, looked at the ceiling. He thought she already wrote to him. She has been waiting for this the whole time. He turned off the light. The second week at Fort Irwin arrived the way second weeks always do in programs like this one. Without ceremony, without adjustment. The desert did not soften. The instructors did not recalibrate their expectations. The schedule did not compress itself to accommodate the people who were struggling. It simply continued the way the Mojave continued. Indifferent, consistent, unimpressed by effort or history or the particular weight a person carried when they walked onto a range at 0600 with 8 hours of bad sleep and a scorecard that was trending in the wrong direction. Carol Voss arrived at the morning briefing 2 minutes early. Same seat, second row left side, clear view of both exits. Harmon noticed. He always noticed. But he gave no indication, just moved through the briefing with the steady efficiency of a man who had learned that the most useful thing a leader could sometimes do was observe without intervening. Shaw arrived with his crew 30 seconds before the briefing started. He glanced at Carol as he passed her row. Did not say anything. Did not need to. The glance carried everything the words would have carried, the particular dismissiveness of someone who has already rendered a verdict and is now simply waiting for the evidence to catch up. Nash arrived last, slid into a seat 3 rows back, and opened his notebook. He had been quiet since the equipment bay. Thinking. The obstacle course was scheduled for 0900. Carol drank her coffee. Black, no sugar. She looked at the briefing materials without reading them. She already knew the layout of the course. She had memorized it the first day, the way she memorized every physical space she operated in, not deliberately, just as a baseline function, the way some people cannot walk into a room without counting the exits. She was thinking about the flashbang. She knew it was coming. It was always on the obstacle course, always positioned at the 3rd station, always triggered by a pressure plate in the ground that you could not avoid without going around and going around, cost you time you did not have. She knew all of this, knowing it had never been the problem. The problem was the sound, not the light, not the disorientation. The sound. It was a very specific frequency, a sharp crack with a particular compression wave that arrived a half second before the light, and that half second was where everything came apart. Because in that half second before her visual cortex had registered what was happening, some other part of her brain had already gone somewhere else entirely. She drank her coffee. She thought, not today. Not again. She was wrong. The obstacle course at Fort Irwin was designed to be unpleasant in the specific way that military training is unpleasant, not cruel but honest. The wall at the first station was 12 feet of rough timber, no handholds requiring grip strength and technique, and the particular willingness to commit your body fully to something before you are certain it will work. The rope bridge at the second station crossed a 16-foot gap, the ropes old and inconsistent, the footing uncertain in a way that rewarded balance over brute force. Carol cleared the first wall cleanly. Her technique was quiet and efficient, none of the grunting effort that some of the younger soldiers displayed. She crossed the rope bridge with the unhurried assurance of someone who had crossed worse over darker drops. Shaw was 2 stations ahead of her. He moved through the course the way he moved through everything aggressively confidently, with a kind of performed ease that was partially real and partially theater. Webb followed behind him, Ricci behind Webb, the three of them, a unit by now calibrated to each other's rhythms. Nash ran alone. He always ran alone. Carol reached the third station. The pressure plate was exactly where she knew it was. She saw it. She understood what was about to happen with the complete unhelpful clarity of someone who can see a thing coming and cannot stop it. She stepped on the plate. The crack arrived first, and then she was somewhere else. Not physically. Her body stayed on the obstacle course at Fort Irwin in the Mojave Desert in the fall of 2024. But the part of her that controlled her body's responses was in a drainage ditch outside a compound in a province that did not make the news on a morning 15 years ago, and the sound she had just heard was not a flashbang simulator. It was the IED that had been buried in the road 12 inches under the surface that their intelligence had said was clear. She heard Rowan's voice, not a memory of his voice, his voice. Voss, Voss, talk to me. Her body went still. Not the tactical stillness she had trained herself to maintain. The other kind. The kind that comes when the body's systems receive contradictory instructions from the brain and, uncertain which to follow, choose none of them. She stood in the middle of the obstacle course and did nothing for 15 seconds. It felt like nothing. 15 seconds is a very long time when people are watching. Harmon's voice reached her from the observation position. Voss, move. She blinked. Fort Irwin came back in pieces, the light, the sand, the heat, the sound of other trainees finishing their runs in the distance. She pushed forward, completed the course. Her time was in the bottom third of the class by a margin that had stopped mattering. In the recovery area, she drank water and controlled her breathing and did not look at anyone. Shaw's voice behind her addressed to Webb, but calibrated to Carey. That is the third time, 3 different scenarios, 3 freezes. At some point, that stops being a performance issue and starts being a safety issue. Webb. She should have flagged this before the program started. That is on her. Ricci said nothing, but Ricci was watching Carol with an expression that had shifted from contempt to something more complicated and less comfortable. Nash said nothing either, but he had been timing the freeze on his watch, and he had seen something in the recovery area that no one else had looked for. Carol's hands as she drank her water, completely steady, not the steadiness of calm, the steadiness of control, the kind that requires active effort from someone managing something significant. He wrote a number in his notebook. 15, circled it. Then below it, he wrote a question. If she is this far gone, why are her hands that steady? Master Chief Harmon filed his morning report. He wrote Carol Voss's score accurately. He noted the freeze accurately. He wrote everything the record required him to write. Then he sat for a while in the silence of his office. He pulled out his personal notes on Carol, a single sheet of paper on which he had been writing observations in a shorthand he had developed over 30 years for exactly this kind of situation. Gear arrangement, field level efficiency, not training center efficiency. This is someone who packed for an environment where disorganization has consequences. Positioning, consistent, instinctive, never varies. She does not think about it. It is already decided before she enters the room. Hands skilled above her reported performance level. Watched her run a malfunction drill in the equipment bay. She cleared a double feed in 2.1 seconds without looking at the weapon. Freeze response triggered specifically by impulsive compression audio stimulus. Not visual, not tactile, auditory. He looked at that last line for a long time. Auditory trigger, specific frequency range, consistent across multiple exposures. He thought about what that meant, about what kind of experience would create that kind of response, about the particular geography of the brain's threat response systems, and what it took to rewire them so deeply that a training simulation could reach across 15 years and pull a person out of the present. He thought about Mogadishu, about the specific sounds he still could not hear without his jaw tightening. 30 years later, and certain sounds still found him. He knew exactly what Carol Voss was carrying. He had carried a version of it himself. The difference was that someone had helped him put it down. He looked at the phone. He wrote one more line in his notes. She is not failing. She is fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously. The course is the easier one. The team tactics exercise was structured around a multi-building scenario. Hostage extraction, multiple hostile actors, civilian role players, full scoring on speed accuracy and casualty prevention. Harmon posted the squad assignments the morning of the exercise. Shaw looked at the list, looked at Carol's name beside his, then looked at Harmon with an expression that asked a question without asking it. Harmon looked back at him with an expression that answered without answering. The squad assembled in the staging area. Shaw took up the natural position of the person who intended to lead, which he did with the practiced authority of someone who had led many times and been right often enough to trust it. Webb and Ritchie flanked him. Nash stood to one side, quiet. Carol stood at the back of the group. Not because anyone told her to. Not yet. Just because it was at this moment the position that allowed her to observe the most while committing the least. The first building went badly from the start. She hesitated at the entry point by half a beat, enough to pull the timing apart. Nash went through the door, first found a hostile actor, waiting took a simulated round to the chest and called his status in a flat voice. Hit, down. Shaw's voice in the comms was controlled but tight. Voss, move when I tell you to move. She nodded, said nothing. The second building was worse. Her positioning on the approach was a fraction wide, and it cost them the initiative on the first room. 2 more casualties marked. Shaw's frustration had moved past the controlled phase and into the territory where decisions start getting made from emotion rather than calculation. He pulled her aside between buildings 3 and 4. He kept his voice low. Barely. He said, I do not know what is going on with you, and at this point I do not care. What I care about is that every time you hesitate, someone on this team pays for it. So I need you to stay in the back, let Webb take the lead positions, and just try not to cost us any more. Carol looked at him. Something passed behind her eyes that Shaw did not catch because he was not looking for it. She said understood. She moved to the back of the formation. And here is what happened that no one in the staging area saw because no one in the staging area was watching for it. Through buildings 4, 5, and 6, Carol Voss moved at the back of the formation. And at every entry point, every corner, every position of exposure, she placed herself quietly without announcement, without disrupting the flow of the exercise in exactly the right place to cover the angles that Shaw's forward-focused approach left open. Webb took a simulated round in Building 4. Nash did not. He had been 2 feet to Webb's left in a position that should have been the more exposed one. He was not hit because Carol from the back of the formation had cleared the angle that the hostile actor would have used if Webb had not drawn his fire first. Nash felt it. He did not understand it yet, but he felt the absence of something bad happening, and he had been in enough training scenarios to know that absences like that do not happen by accident. The exercise ended with 4 casualties. A failing score. Shaw's face in the staging area was the particular kind of controlled anger that well-trained people wear when they want to say something they know they should not. He looked at Carol. He said it anyway. This is what I was talking about. You cannot carry dead weight in a scenario like this and expect anything but failure. Carol finished clearing her weapon. She did not look up. Shaw turned to Harmon. I am requesting a formal review. I am requesting that she be evaluated independently so her performance stops affecting other people's records. Harmon said, I will review the footage. That night, he reviewed the footage for 2 hours. He watched it 4 times. He kept his attention away from Carol's failures, which were real, which were documented, which told the story that everyone else was reading. He focused instead on the geometry of every position she occupied. On the 4th viewing, he saw it. Building 5. Nash at the corner. Carol 3 steps behind him, formation rear. No tactical reason to be angled the way she was angled. But she was angled to cover a doorway that was 12 feet off Nash's left shoulder, a doorway that the hostile actor emerged from 0.8 seconds later. Carol had been covering that doorway before the actor appeared. She had not reacted to a threat. She had anticipated one. He went back, watched buildings 4 and 6. Same pattern, different positions, same outcome. Every time someone in that formation should have taken a training round and did not, Carol Voss was somewhere she had no assigned reason to be covering an angle that no one else was covering. Harmon sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a long while. Then he called Nash. Nash answered on the 2nd ring. Yes, Master Chief. Harmon kept his voice even. In the last 3 exercises, have you taken a hit? Nash paused. No, Master Chief. How many other class members have taken at least one? Another pause. Longer. 11 out of 13. Harmon said, think about that. He ended the call. The dismissal paperwork arrived on Wednesday morning. Harmon signed it where he had to sign. He did it slowly the way you do a thing when you know it is wrong and cannot yet see a way to make it right. The administrative machinery had its own momentum, and 2 weeks of consistent substandard performance had given that machinery everything it needed to run. Carol was notified at 1400 hours. She received the notification the same way she received everything without visible reaction, without the kind of protest or argument that might have signaled surprise. She was not surprised. She returned to her room, sat at the small desk, took out her training manual, opened it to pages 44 and 45. The envelope was still there. She picked it up, held it in her hands for a moment, looked at the name written on the outside. Colonel Grant Teller. She had written the letter 8 days ago. She had written it knowing this moment would come, knowing that the process would run its course at a speed that no individual could slow without the right intervention, and that the right intervention required the right person, and that the right person was 3 time zones away with a schedule that answered to different priorities than a training program in the Mojave. She set it back in the envelope, set it on the desk in front of her. She could mail it. That was always an option. But mailing it meant not trusting what she had believed for 8 days. That Grant Teller who had known her since before any of this, who had been the last person she had operated with at full capacity before the weight of 2009 had changed the shape of everything, would not need a letter to tell him what she needed. She would give it one more day. She lay on her bunk, looked at the ceiling. She thought about Rowan. Not the last day. Earlier than that. The morning of a routine patrol 2 weeks before the IED, when they had sat in the back of a vehicle waiting for clearance, and Rowan had said out of nowhere, the way he said most things, "You know what the problem is with people who are really good at something?" She had said, "Tell me." He had said, "They stop believing they are allowed to be." She had asked him what he meant by that. He had shrugged. "Just something I think about. People who have seen a lot, done a lot. At some point, they start treating their own ability like it is something they borrowed instead of something they earned. Like using it fully would be taking more than their share." She had said, "That is either very wise or completely wrong." He had laughed. "That is the problem," he had said. "You cannot always tell which until later." She had been trying to tell which for 15 years. Harmon found her at 2100 hours. Not in her room on the range. Range 7, the same range where she had been at 0430 on the first morning. The lights were off. Fort Irwin ranges went dark at 2000 hours, but there was enough moon in a clear Mojave sky to see by if you knew how to use it. And Carol Voss was standing at the firing line, running through weapons handling drills without ammunition, working through the mechanics in pure muscle memory. He watched from 30 meters back without announcing himself. He watched her run through magazine changes, malfunction, clearances, target transitions. Every movement fluid and certain and utterly automatic. The performance of someone for whom the weapon had long since stopped being a tool and become an extension of thought rather than effort. He watched for 3 minutes. Then he walked to the firing line and stood beside her. She did not stop what she was doing, did not look at him. He said, "I know about Rowan Kidd." Her hand stilled. "Not much. A fraction." Then continued. "I looked at your file," he said. "The parts that existed and the parts that did not. There is enough in the margins if you know what to look for." She said nothing. He said he did not make it. Statement, not question. She did not confirm it, and she did not deny it. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am asking because I think I already know the answer." She stopped the drill, held the rifle at low ready, looked at the dark targets downrange. He said, after Rowan, "Were you punishing yourself? Or were you waiting for someone to give you permission to come back?" The desert breathed around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and went quiet. 10 seconds passed. She said, "I do not think those are different things." He looked at her profile. At the particular stillness of someone who has been carrying something for so long, it has become structural load-bearing, the kind of weight you cannot simply set down because you have built your architecture around it. He said, "I know. I spent 8 months thinking the same thing." After Mogadishu. She turned and looked at him then, not sharply, just looked at him. The way you look at someone who has said something you understood completely and had never expected to hear. He said, "Someone found me on a range in 1994 and said 4 words that I could not argue with. I am not going to pretend I know what your 4 words are, but I know who does." Her eyes moved, just once, briefly, toward the gate at the far end of the base. He said, "Get some sleep, Voss." He walked back toward the administration building. In his office, he sat down. At 21:37 hours, a text message arrived from a number he had saved under a single initial. "T-Land at 0630. Have her on the range at 0900. Harmon looked at the message. Then he typed back, "She will be there." He sat for a long time after that. He thought about Range 4 in the fall of 1994, about the specific quality of that night, the cold, the smell of spent ammunition, the sound of his own boots on the hardpack, and about the 4 words that had changed the direction of everything that came after. He thought about the fact that he had never told anyone about that night. Not his wife, not his commanding officer, not any of the soldiers he had run through programs like this one in the 9 years since. Some things you carry privately, because the carrying is part of what they mean. He thought about Carol Voss on a dark range with a rifle she was not supposed to have out running drills with the precision of someone for whom 30 years had made the weapon an extension of thought rather than effort. He thought tomorrow. He turned off the light. The SUV arrived at 0623. Carol was already on the range when it came through the gate. Not range 7 this time. The main qualification range where the morning's final evaluation would take place in 2 hours and 37 minutes. She was not shooting. She was standing at the firing line with her rifle slung and her hands at her sides, looking downrange at targets she could not yet see clearly in the early light. She heard the vehicle before she saw it. The sound of tires on the access road that ran along the eastern perimeter. The particular weight of a government vehicle moving at a pace that was neither urgent nor casual. She did not turn around. She already knew what it was. She had known since the previous night, since the moment Harmon had stood beside her on the dark range, and she had understood that the machinery had finally begun moving in the right direction. She heard the door open, heard footsteps on the hardpack. She turned around. Grant Teller was 64 years old. He had put on some weight since the last time she had seen him at a retirement ceremony in Virginia 3 years ago, but he wore it the way men wear weight when they have earned it, settled without apology. His hair was fully gray now, cut short in the way he had worn it for 40 years. His face had the particular quality of faces that have been outdoors in difficult conditions for most of a lifetime, weathered past the point where age made much additional difference. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, plain shirt, the kind of boots that had seen actual use. No uniform, no rank insignia, nothing that announced what he was or had been. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. There was a particular grammar to reunions between people who have been through significant things together, and part of that grammar is the recognition that some things do not require the preamble that ordinary conversation needs, that certain people have earned the right to start in the middle. Teller said, "You look tired." She said, "You look old." He almost smiled. 30 years and that is what you have for me." She said, "I have been conserving." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked downrange at the targets in the early light, at the pale desert morning assembling itself around them. He said, "Dale Harmon called me 10 days ago." She said, "I know." He said, "He is a good man." She said, "I know that too." Teller put his hands in his jacket pockets. He had the quality of stillness that certain people develop when they have spent years in environments where unnecessary movement draws attention. He said, "I read what was left of your file, the parts that still exist." She waited. He said, "And I thought about what you were doing here and why you came back to a program like this after 3 years of sitting it out and what it would mean for a person like you to spend 2 weeks performing failure in front of people half your age." He paused. He said, "It takes more discipline to do that than to do the thing you were holding back. You know that." She said, "I am aware." He said, "So I want you to tell me something before we go any further. Not for my benefit, for yours." She looked at him. He said, "After Rowan, were you ever going to come back on your own?" The desert was very quiet around them. In the distance, the base was beginning its morning routines, vehicles moving doors, opening the sounds of a facility waking up to another day. Carol looked at the targets downrange. She said, "I do not know. I thought maybe if I put myself somewhere difficult enough, something would force the question." Teller said, "She said the question got forced. It just did not get answered." He nodded slowly. The way you nod when someone has confirmed something you already understood but needed to hear directly. He said, "I am going to go talk to Harmon now. You go get your gear. Be on the main range at 0900. He started to turn away. She said, "Grant." He stopped. She said, "The envelope. In my training manual, I was going to send it if you did not come." He turned back and looked at her. Something in his face that was not quite emotion and not quite the absence of it. The particular expression of someone who has been carrying a care for another person across a long distance and a long time. He said, "I know. That is partly why I came before you could." He walked back toward the SUV. She turned back to the range, to the targets assembling themselves in the growing light, to the morning that had finally arrived after 2 weeks of waiting for it. She took a slow breath. She thought about Rowan Kidd. She thought, "I know. I heard you the first time. I just was not ready." She thought, "I think I might be ready now." Harmon posted the final evaluation roster at 0730. The class assembled in the staging area at 0845. Full gear weapons loaded with training ammunition, faces arranged in the various expressions that people wear when they know that what happens in the next hour will matter. Shaw was focused, contained the aggressive confidence he normally wore, dialed down to something more functional. Webb and Ricci ran their final gear checks with professional efficiency. Nash stood apart quiet, his notebook in his breast pocket. Carol arrived at 0858. She took her position in the formation without ceremony. Shaw looked at her. His expression said what it always said, but with less energy behind it than it had carried last week. He had been quieter since the team exercise. Not kinder, just quieter in the way that people get quiet when something has introduced doubt into a system that was previously running on certainty. Harmon stood at the front of the staging area. Beside him, slightly off to one side, stood Grant Teller. No introduction was offered. Teller was simply present, hands behind his back, watching the class with the focused attention of someone who had come a long distance to see a specific thing. Shaw noticed him, looked at Harmon for explanation, received none. Harmon delivered the briefing. Urban hostage rescue, 4 buildings, multiple hostile actors, civilian role players. Time limit 30 minutes, standard scoring. He ran through the rules of engagement with the brisk efficiency of someone who had delivered the same briefing 200 times. He assigned squad positions. Carol was in the same squad as Shaw. Again. Shaw's jaw tightened. He said nothing. The squad moved out. The first building was a narrow structure at the north end of the evaluation complex, 2 stories, 3 rooms per floor. Shaw stacked the entry team with Webb on point himself, second, Richie third. He put Carol fourth. She took the position without comment. The entry went well. Webb moved cleanly. Shaw covered his angles. Richie handled the stairwell. The first floor cleared in 40 seconds with no casualties. Then they reached the second floor. Carol was at the back of the formation on the landing, covering the stairwell behind them, when she saw something that Shaw, focused entirely on the door in front of him, did not see. A Rhodes player in a civilian vest had appeared in the doorway of a room they had already cleared, which meant either the role player had moved or there had been a second person in that room that the clearing team had missed. She said nothing. She did not break formation. She simply repositioned herself by 3 feet, placing her body between Nash and the doorway. The role player raised a training weapon. Carol engaged, one controlled double tap. The role player called hit and stepped back. The squad barely paused. They were already moving to the next room. Nash looked at her over his shoulder. She looked back at him, kept moving. In the observation area, Teller made no visible reaction. He simply noted it and filed it in the place where he stored information about Carol Voss, a file that had been building since Somalia in 1994 and had never once surprised him with what it contained. Harmon, standing beside him, had also seen it. The 2 men exchanged no words. They had worked alongside each other long enough that the exchange of information sometimes required nothing but proximity. The second building was where the evaluation began to shift. Shaw's approach to the entry was tactically clean, but slightly fast. He was running on the competitive instinct to post a good time, and speed was pulling at his decision-making in ways he was not fully tracking. The first room cleared without incident. The second room had a hostile actor behind an obstacle that Shaw's approach had not accounted for. Webb took a simulated round, called hit, moved to the wall. Shaw adjusted, brought Richie up, continued the push. Carol moved into the position Webb had vacated, and here is what happened and why it mattered. Carol Voss, in the position of a soldier who had been performing at the bottom of her class for 2 weeks, began making adjustments to the formation that were so subtle and so continuous that they registered not as actions, but as conditions. She was not leading. She was not overriding Shaw's decisions. She was operating like a tide under the surface of the exercise, shifting angles by degrees, occupying positions a half second before they became critical, creating outcomes that appeared to be the result of the formation's choices rather than her own. 3 rooms, 3 hostile actors who found their engagement windows closing before they could fully use them. Not because Shaw's tactics were brilliant, because the geometry of every entry was slightly more favorable than it should have been, shaped by a woman at the back of the formation who was doing things that do not appear on scoring rubrics. Nash felt it. He could not name it yet, but he felt it the way you feel a current under calm water. They exited the second building with 0 casualties. Shaw noted it with satisfaction, attributed it to his adjusted approach. Moved to Building 3. Building 3 was the complex one. 3 floors, irregular layout, 6 role players, 2 civilian hostages. The kind of scenario where a single error in sequencing could cascade into total failure. Shaw took the building the way he had taken everything else forward, confident, with the sincere conviction of someone who had enough ability to make confidence reasonable if not always sufficient. They were on the second floor when Teller stepped forward. He moved to the perimeter fence at the edge of the evaluation zone. He waited until there was a natural break in the action, the squad transitioning between rooms, a 2-second pause, while Shaw assessed the next entry point. In that pause, Teller's voice crossed the distance between the observation area and the building. Not loud, not theatrical. The particular carrying quality of a voice that had spent decades learning to be heard exactly as far as it needed to be heard, and no further. He said, "Voss, finish it." 2 words. 2 words that meant nothing to Shaw or Webb or Richie or Nash. 2 words from a man who had been in a vehicle in Somalia in 1994 and had turned to a 28-year-old staff sergeant and said the same thing before the worst night either of them would ever have, and who had watched her walk through it with a completeness that he had never forgotten. 2 words that meant I was there. I remember who you were. I am telling you that person is still present and that this moment requires her. 2 words that were not a code, not a program, not a classified trigger, just the truth delivered by the one person on earth who had been carrying it alongside her long enough to know when to say it out loud. Carol Voss stood in the doorway of a plywood room on the second floor of a training building in the Mojave Desert. And something changed. Not dramatically, not with the quality of a switch being thrown, more like the way a room changes when someone opens a window that has been shut for a long time. The pressure equalizing, the air moving, the particular relief of a thing that has been held becoming simply released. She stepped forward. What followed was not a transformation in the cinematic sense. There were no impossible shots, no physics-defying movement, no superhuman speed that 20-year-olds could not match. What there was mastery, 30 years of it, earned through the accumulation of 10,000 hours of serious work in serious conditions. Each hour building on the last, each experience, adding a layer of understanding that eventually becomes something that operates below the level of conscious thought. Carol moved through that building the way water moves through known terrain. Not fast in the way that looks impressive from the outside. Fast in the deeper sense, the sense of a person who has already solved the problem before the problem has fully presented itself, who arrives at the answer while other people are still reading the question. Her rifle came up with the particular certainty of something that knows exactly where it needs to be. Target acquisition was not a process. It was a conclusion already reached. Room 1 on the second floor. 2 hostile actors, 1 civilian. Carol entered on Shaw's left shoulder and had both actors engaged before Shaw had fully committed to his own target. Clean, controlled, no wasted motion. Shaw processed what had just happened. He looked at the 2 marked actors, looked at Carol, looked at the timer on the wall. He said nothing. Room 2, a hostile actor had positioned himself behind a civilian, a classic configuration designed to force a decision under pressure. Carol paused, a half second. Then she moved 3 steps left, changed her angle, and the configuration ceased to be a problem. The civilian was unmarked. The actor was hit. Webb stared. The third floor was the hostage room. 1 civilian, 3 hostile actors, arranged in a pattern that had defeated 7 of the 14 squads who had run it that week. The geometry was deliberately unfavorable. Any direct entry exposed the civilian to crossfire, and the room's dimensions made angles nearly impossible to manage with conventional clearing technique. Carol stood in the doorway for 1.2 seconds. She read the room the way you read a room when you have spent years in rooms where reading wrong was not an academic failure but a permanent one. She said to Shaw quietly, "Go left on entry. Do not stop moving." Shaw, for the first time in 2 weeks, followed her lead without question. They went in. The room took 9 seconds. The civilian was unmarked. All 3 actors called hit. The buzzer sounded. The tone was different this time. The staging area was quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when people are processing something that does not fit the available categories. Shaw stood with his helmet in his hands, looking at nothing in particular. The aggressive certainty that had defined his presence in the program for 2 weeks had not disappeared. But it had developed a crack, the kind that changes the structural properties of a thing, even when it does not yet show from the outside. Webb was looking at Carol with an expression that had moved through several phases in the last 30 minutes and had not yet settled into any of them. Ricci, who had been the sharpest and the quietest of the 4, was sitting on a gear crate, with her forearms on her knees studying the ground, with the focused attention of someone revising a position they had held with confidence. Nash was writing in his notebook. Carol was running the post-evaluation clearing drill on her rifle. The same drill she always ran. The same precise sequence of motions she had run after every evaluation for 2 weeks regardless of the score. Consistent, unhurried, exactly 90 seconds. Harmon walked to her. He said, "Voss." She looked up. He said, "Course record, by 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She looked back at her rifle, completed the drill. She said, "The geometry on building 3. The eastern corner was covered wrong all week. Someone should fix that." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I will note it." He walked back to where Teller was standing. The 2 men stood together and watched the staging area settle back into its ordinary rhythms. Harmon said, "No program. That is what you told me." Teller said, "That is right." Harmon said, 30 years and 1 bad day. Teller said, "And someone who needed to hear that the bad day did not cancel the 30 years. Harmon looked at Carol across the staging area, at the way she moved through the post-evaluation routine with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to everything. He said, "I should have called you on day 1, Chernoam." Teller said, "No. She needed the 2 weeks." Harmon looked at him. Teller said she needed to know that she could hold it together under that kind of pressure, that the freeze was not who she was, that she could carry it and still function, still protect people. She could not know that until she had done it, and she could not do it without the circumstances forcing the question. He paused. He said, "She came here looking for something. She found it." Harmon said, "That is a hard way to find something." Teller said, "Most of the important things are." The debrief was in the small conference room off the main corridor. Harmon, Teller, Carol. The door closed. Harmon went through the scoring. Factual, complete, unhurried. Course record. 0 casualties in the final 2 buildings. Correct civilian protection in every scenario. When he finished, he set the forms down. He said, I want to ask you something and I want a straight answer. Carol waited. He said, the last 2 weeks, the positioning, building people into positions where they would not take hits. Was that deliberate from the start? She said, from day 4. He said, day 4. She said, it took me 3 days to map the patterns and how Shaw ran his formations. After that, it was straightforward. Harmon said, and the freezes. She said, real. All of them. He said, but you kept functioning. She said, barely. Some days barely. He said, that is still functioning. She looked at the table, then back at him. Something in her face that was not quite relief and not quite grief. Something that lived in the space between things that have been carried and things that are being carefully set down. She said Rowan used to say that the difference between people who have been through serious things and people who have not is that the people who have know that barely is enough. That barely gets you to the next position. That barely keeps your people alive. Teller, who had been quiet throughout, said he was not wrong. Carol looked at him. He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. Her envelope. Her handwriting on the outside, his name, the letter she had written on day 8 and kept between pages 44 and 45 of her training manual. Unopened, she looked at it, then at him. He said, I did not need to read it. I already knew what it said. She said, then why bring it? He said, because you wrote it. Because you spent 8 days deciding whether to send it. Because that took something from you, and the least I can do is give it back unopened. She picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, then she put it in her jacket pocket. Harmon opened the desk drawer. He took out a folder, plain unmarked. He placed it on the table in front of Teller without ceremony. Teller looked at it, at the edges of pages visible at the top, at the particular way certain sections had been removed and others remained. He said, Dale. Harmon said, you recognized her on day 2. I know you did because I recognized her on day 2, and the only reason I know what I was recognizing is because someone recognized it in me first. He tapped the folder. He said, after Mogadishu, 8 months of performing adequate. Running drills I could have run at 70% of my actual capacity and never been caught. You knew. You knew from the first week. A long silence in the small room. Teller said, I suspected. Harmon said, you found me on range 4 in the fall of 1994. I was running night drills. You stood next to me and you said 4 words, and then you walked away and you never brought it up again. Teller said nothing. Harmon said, what did you say to her this morning? Teller said, Voss, finish it. Harmon said 2 words. Teller said she only needed 2. Harmon looked at him, then at Carol, then back at the folder on the table, the one with pages missing the record of 11 years that did not exist on paper. He said, what did you say to me in 1994? Teller looked at him for a long moment. He said, I said you have not used it all up. The room was very quiet. Harmon said 4 words. Teller said you counted wrong. Contractions count as 2. Something moved through the room then, not exactly humor, not exactly grief, something that existed in the particular register of people who have been through enough together that the ordinary emotional categories stop being adequate and something more compressed takes their place. Carol said quietly, he told me the same thing, different words. The 2 men looked at her. She said 2 weeks before the IED, in the back of a vehicle waiting for clearance. He said people who are really good at something stop believing they are allowed to be. He was talking about me. I knew he was talking about me, and I did not say anything, and 6 weeks later he was gone, and I never got to tell him that I heard him. She stopped. She said, I have been trying to tell him ever since. The silence that followed was the kind that does not need to be filled. After a while, Harmon stood. He picked up his folder. He said, the discharge recommendation has been withdrawn. Your final evaluation score will be entered into the record this afternoon. Assignment recommendations will be processed through normal channels. He paused at the door. He said, the range is yours tomorrow morning if you want it. 0430. No one else has it booked. He left. The room was quiet. Carol and Teller sat with the particular ease of people who have known each other long enough that silence requires no management. After a while, Teller said, you are going to request instructor assignment. She said, tactical instruction, special operations training command. He said, good. She said, I want to build something, a program, specifically for people coming back from difficult deployments, people who are holding back for the reasons I was holding back. He said, you will need support from above. She said, I know a colonel. He almost smiled, the same almost smile from the range at dawn, the one that had been 30 years in the making. He said, yeah, you do. He stood, picked up his jacket. At the door, he stopped. He said, one more thing, and then I will go. She looked at him. He said, Rowan knew you heard him. What he said to you in the back of that vehicle about people not believing they are allowed to use what they have earned, he knew it landed. He told me the week before the IED that he had said something to you and he thought it had gotten through. He paused. He said he was glad he had said it. He told me that specifically, that he was glad he had said it while he had the chance. He paused again. He said I should have told you that 15 years ago. I do not have a good reason why I did not. I am sorry. She did not say anything for a long time. The debrief room was small and very quiet. Outside the base continued its routines. The ordinary sounds of a place engaged in serious work, indifferent to the specific weight of what was happening in one small room off the main corridor. She said finally it did land. She stopped. She said, I just needed 15 years to admit it. Teller looked at her. The almost smile completed itself for the first time. Not large, just present. The particular expression of someone who has been carrying a care for another person across a long time and is watching it finally discharged. He said, that is fast for some people. He left. She sat alone in the small room for a while. She thought about Rowan, not the last day, not the IED, not the silence that followed. She thought about a morning in the back of a vehicle, the sun not yet fully up. His voice arriving before his point did, the way it always did, saying something that she had carried for 15 years without knowing. It was the most important thing anyone had ever said to her. People who are really good at something stop believing they are allowed to be. She had heard him. She had always heard him. She took the envelope from her jacket pocket, the one Teller had returned unopened. She held it for a moment, then she tore it in half, set it on the table, left it there. She did not need it anymore. What she had written in it had already been said by other means in a debrief room in the Mojave to the two people who needed to hear it. Rowan had always known how to make a point land. She stood, picked up her rifle, ran the clearing drill. 90 seconds. She walked out into the afternoon light. Shaw found her outside the equipment bay at 1700 hours. He had clearly been working up to this for several hours. His posture had the quality of someone who has made a decision they are not entirely comfortable with, but have decided is necessary anyway. He stopped a few feet away from her and looked at the ground briefly before looking at her. He said, I want to say something. She waited. He said, for 2 weeks I decided what you were. I decided early and I did not look for anything that contradicted it. That is not the kind of officer I want to be. She looked at him, not with warmth exactly, but without the neutrality she had maintained throughout the program, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She said, you saw exactly what I showed you. The decision you made from that information was not wrong. It was incomplete. He said, I should have looked harder. She said, yes. But looking hard at people who seem to be failing takes something that most people do not develop until they have failed at something themselves. He processed that. It was not entirely comfortable to receive. But he received it. He said, Building 3, the hostage room. How did you know the angle on the left entry? She said, geometry. The room was 12 by 14. 3 actors, 1 hostage, standard positioning protocol. The only angle that protected the hostage on entry was hard left continuous movement. It was not instinct, it was arithmetic. He looked at her for a moment. He said, you have been doing that the whole time. The geometry. She said, since day 4. He stood with that. He said, okay. He nodded once, walked away. It was not an absolution. It was not a friendship. It was the particular resolution available between people who have been on opposite sides of something and have arrived without quite intending to at a mutual understanding of what it actually was. Carol watched him go. It was enough. The morning after Range 7, 430, Carol at the firing line. The desert still dark, the stars still present, the particular quality of Mojave pre-dawn that she had been carrying in her memory since the first morning without knowing she was carrying it. Footsteps on the hard pack behind her. She did not turn around. Nash stopped a few feet to her right. He had his notebook in his breast pocket and an expression that suggested he had been up for a while and had arrived at several conclusions about things he had been sitting with for 2 weeks. They stood together at the firing line for a moment. He said, were you ever going to tell anyone what you were doing out here? She looked at the targets assembling themselves in the first gray light. She said, a sergeant told me something a long time ago. He had 30 years on me, and he had been to places that did not make the record. And one afternoon he sat down next to me and said, the ones who have really been through it do not need to announce it. The work announces itself. She raised the rifle. She said, I believed him then. I stopped believing him for a while. I think I believe him again now. She fired 6 shots. The desert answered with 6 clean echoes and then returned to its ordinary silence. 6 rounds through the same ragged hole in the center of the first silhouette. She lowered the rifle, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber. Nash looked at the target downrange. He did not say anything. Some things do not require it. The sun broke the horizon and the Mojave went from gray to gold in the particular way it does, completely without transition, as if the darkness and the light had agreed in advance that hesitation served neither of them. Carol Voss stood in the morning light with her weapons safed and her brass collected, and 30 years of earned knowledge that had never not once belonged to anyone but her. She had just needed permission to use it again. She had it now.